prestigious occasion of the African Languages Week. I wish you all a happy African Languages Week 2025.
My name is Margaret Nanchinga, coordinator of the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee, the Committee of the African Academy of Languages. On behalf of the committee, I would like to congratulate all of Africa for reaching this year's African Languages Week, 21st to 28th of February 2025.
Initially, when I presented the proposal to the Specialized Technical Committee, Youth, Culture and Sport, we had proposed 24 to 30 January due to the fact that the mission for the African Academy of Languages, Makalan, began operating on January 24, 2001. When former President of Mali, His Excellency Alpha Oumar Konaré, established it by presidential decree on December 19, 2000. President Konaré subsequently became the first chairperson of the African Union after its transformation from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union in 2002. However, after the inaugural edition, we encountered some difficulties in marking the event. Firstly, that initial period usually coincides with the resumption of many from Christmas and New Year holidays. At the African Union also, many things are not yet finalized. Secondly, African Union summits usually take place during this period, which further makes things difficult for us. After consultation, we thought that it would be more convenient to have the dates moved a little further. During the fourth Specialized Technical Committee, Youth, Culture and Sport, that took place at the African Union Commission from 22 to 26 May 2023. I presented the proposal for the change of dates and the reasons to the Committee of Honorable Ministers that adopted it unanimously. The proposal was further adopted by the 43rd Ordinary Session of the Executive Council during the 5th Mid-Year Coordination Meeting of the African Union, Regional Economic Communities and Regional Mechanisms, which took place from 13 to 16 July 2023 in Nairobi, Kenya. At the same Mid-Year Coordination Meeting, the final adoption was done by the heads of state and government. From the third edition 2024, the African Languages Week is officially programmed from 21 to 28 February. Akalan's proposal for a decade of African languages alongside the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022-2032 of the United Nations to be implemented within Akalan's mandate and programs was also adopted, as well as our proposal to revise the African Union's Language Plan of Action for Africa to incorporate the Assembly decision on Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and language of wider communication in Africa. We will note now that the African Languages Week coincides with the United Nations Mother Language Day, which will make it easier for the African countries to mark both events whose objectives are not different.
This is the fourth edition of the African Languages Week. The edition of celebrating African languages as factors of African integration and development. The week's theme, African Languages, Voices for Reparations, Justice and the Dignity for the Africa We Want, was aligned with the African Union theme for this year, which is Justice for Africans and the people of African descent through reparations. By aligning the theme of the fourth edition of the African Languages Week with the continental goal, the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee reaffirms the role of African languages as essential levers for justice, dignity, and social transformation. The sub-themes are African languages for the restoration of the dignity of people of African descent. The second one is breaking the chains of language oppression, reparations and language empowerment for Africans and people of African descent. And the third is promoting African languages for digital inclusion, transformation, and social justice. By aligning its priorities with those of the African Union's Language Plan of Action for Africa, the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee positions itself as a strategic platform to assist ACALAN in preparing itself as a strategic platform for African Languages Week as a foundation for sustainable social and cultural justice for the continent and its diaspora. It also portrays the indispensable role of African languages as tools for sustainable development through their role in ensuring inclusion of the Africans in the development process to ensure participation of all. However, reparations are needed for African languages, which for a long time in colonial and post-colonial times were portrayed as inhibitors to education success and incapable of carrying high knowledge. They were always quashed in the education system through punishments given to children for speaking their mother tongue at school. This affected their positioning, leading to their exclusion in education and sustainable development processes, and by so doing, delaying Africa's development through linguistic segregation of the African. This needs redress.
The African Academy of Languages is the African Union specialized language institution whose mandate is to develop and promote African languages, the use of African languages as a means of fostering the integration and socioeconomic development of the African continent. ACALAN is responsible for empowering African languages so that they can be used in all domains of life by encouraging the formulation and implementation of dynamic and articulated language policies, as well as the sharing of experiences in policy development and implementation in the African Union member states as a means of using African languages in a wider range of domains. The Secretariat, under my leadership, came up with two major proposals in 2017 and 2018. One, the African Languages Week proposal, and two, Kiswahili as a working language of the African Union and language of wider communication in Africa. One day, I was invited to speak online in the celebration of the Chinese Language Day on April 20. I have always been called to take part in a language day and week celebration event. After presenting my paper on behalf of the African Union, I sat back in my office and talked to myself. You always go and talk about the importance of celebrating non-African languages. What about African languages? Then I started researching how the celebration of these languages is presented. It was in this manner in late 2017 that I formulated the proposal, and the then Senior Project and Program Officer, Dr. Ojo Babajide Johnson, and I fine-tuned it. The proposal was presented to the governing board of ACALAN, which is the Academy's highest policy organ, for endorsement. Then it was presented to the African Union's third specialized technical committee on youth, culture and sport in October 2018 in Algiers, Algeria, which unanimously adopted it. After its adoption by the Executive Council and the subsequent endorsement of the heads of state and government of the African Union, we proudly launched the African Languages Week in collaboration with the government of Burkina Faso in Ouagadougou in July 2021.
At the planning meeting of the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee, which took place at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on the 11th and 12th of December 2024, the following recommendations were made as way of redress. 1. To the African Union, it was recommended that the Union allocates funds for dissemination of knowledge on sustainable development in African languages to ensure broad and effective inclusion. The committee also recommended to the African Union that it encourages its member states to develop language policies that place African languages at the heart of their educational, cultural, and economic activities. It was also recommended that the African Union promotes historical reparation by advocating for official recognition by former colonial powers, their role in the relegation of African languages, and encourage symbolic and concrete reparation actions.
At the Ouagadougou launching, one of the major recommendations was that ACALAN should establish the Continental Standing Committee to assist the Secretariat in the planning and organization of the event. A 25-member African Languages Week Coordinating Committee composed of members from the 5 regions of Africa plus its diaspora was immediately established, respecting the African Union's policy of geographic spread. The committee was coordinated by Professor Wangui Wagoro, a Kenyan academic, social critic, researcher, translator, and writer. During the inaugural edition of the African Languages Week in 2022, she was succeeded by Mrs. Margaret Nankinga from Uganda, also coordinator of ACALAN's Luganda, Luzoga, Lugwere Vehicular Cross-Border Language Commission. The main role of the committee is to stimulate more dynamism for the development and promotion of African languages across the African continent and in the diaspora. The committee assists ACALAN in the annual celebration and ensures the smooth running of the activities of the African Languages Week by proposing the theme for each year and mobilizing resources human, technical, and financial, for planning and organizing the activities of the week throughout the continent and in the diaspora, in collaboration with the national language structures in the member states serving as ACALAN's national focal institutions through communication, advocacy, and lobbying. In 2002, which was the inaugural edition, the African Languages Week Coordinating Committee identified the theme as African Languages, Levers for the Africa We Want, in line with the African Union's theme for 2021. In 2023, the committee chose African languages for sustainable food security, cultural and socioeconomic development for the Africa we want, also in line with the African Union theme for 2022. The theme for the third edition was Empowering African Languages for Quality Education and Free Trade for the Africa we want, reflecting again on the themes of the African Union for 2023 and 2024, which were acceleration of the African Continental Free Trade Area and Education and Skill Africa for the 21st century, respectively. The African Languages Week Coordinating Committee also identified 5 sub-themes for the 2024 edition of the African Languages Week. 1. Developing and implementing policies for African languages empowerment. 2. Multilingualism for quality education and free trade across Africa. 3. African languages as foundation for literacy and education in Africa. 4. Cross-border languages as levers for digitalization and free cross-border trade in Africa. 5. Literacy is the ability to read and write in the mother tongue. The committee also identified 2 key activities that, if carried out by all member states of the African Union, would mobilize Africa's populace and governments to achieve the objectives of the theme. The 2 events are: 1. Public talks through which committee members and members of the civil society would work with governments and non-governmental organizations to organize public talks on empowering African languages for quality education and free trade. 2. Media campaigns on African language promotion to urge parents and caregivers to buy books in African languages for their children and community libraries, book donations and children's reading competitions inclusive. The theme for this 4th edition, 2025, is African Languages, Voices for Reparations, Justice, and the Dignity of the People for the Africa we want. Again, reflecting on the African Union theme for 2025. And the sub-themes are African Languages, Voices for Restoration of the Dignity of the People of African Descent. 2. Breaking the Chains of Linguistic Oppression, Reparations, and Language Empowerment for Africans and people of African descent. 3. Promoting African languages for digital inclusion, transformation, and social justice. The slogan for this year's edition 2025 is My Language, My Heritage, My Dignity.
All of us can contribute to the development of our languages by speaking, writing, and digitizing them. A language that has no speakers is a dead language. So whatever we do, if we don't speak our languages, it's like we are killing them. So as we commemorate the African Languages Week this year, 2025, I wish you happy celebrations of your languages, the African languages, as tools of peace and development. Let's speak our languages. Let's embrace our languages. Let us write our languages and let us digitize our languages. Mwebale nnyo bassebo ne bannyabo. Asanteni sana. Thank you so much.
The African Languages Week is an awareness call. Therefore, we Africans have to be dedicated to the promotion of African cultures and languages. The African Languages Week is a time of reflection, a time of suggestions, a time of propositions, a time of efforts and action to develop African languages and promote their use as a factor of African integration and development, peace and prosperity. The fact that Africa is the most linguistically diverse continent in the world, we cannot continue to rely on the former colonial languages that only about 30% of Africans, of the African population, understand and use, to the detriment of African languages. The majority understands best and use. We are emphasizing that Akalan is not against any language. We are just standing for linguistic justice and democracy. We acknowledge that all languages are important to their speakers, especially. Languages are assets, particularly to their speakers. Firstly, all languages are partner languages for Akalan. However, we cannot continue to rely on foreign languages alone that only a small portion of the African population understand and use, to the detriment of our languages that most people understand and use. I would like to emphasize that cultural development is inevitably one of the main factors of the sustainable development of a people. The development of African languages as one of the main pillars of African cultures is therefore an indispensable factor in Africa's integration and development. We therefore call on our leaders and policy makers to provide the necessary support for our efforts to develop and promote our values and cultures. We also call on the civil society to double their effort so that African languages can become effective working and official languages and languages of instruction in the existing multilingual context. A happy African Languages Week to you all. Long live the African Union. Long live the African Academy of Languages. Long live the African Languages Week.